Hey everyone, today we're going to be looking at the Bluetti EB150 power station with a massive 1500 watt hour battery inside. Let's check it out. And recently I have been testing a number of small and mid-sized solar generators, including the Bluetti AC50, which is a 500 watt hour unit. And when Bluetti reached out to me to ask if I wanted to test a larger unit, I jumped at the chance. Mostly because I think my audience is interested in finding out if there really are good alternatives to the Goal Zero Yeti 1000 and 1500. Now let's get this out of the way right now. The most notable thing about the EB150 is the price. It's only $1,000, which is pretty remarkable for something with 1500 watt hours of power. And the reviews are actually really good. And speaking of reviews, if you've watched a YouTube video on this in the past, Bluetti's actually made a few improvements that they haven't talked about, and I'll cover those soon. So the front of the unit's nice and clean. There is the same exact display from the AC50, which is just okay. There are separate buttons to activate the DC and AC portions. You hold them down for a few seconds each. There is an 8mm input for the wall charger or up to 500 watts of MPPT solar charging. Below that is the regulated 12 volt output, and to the left of that is a 45 watt power delivery USB-C and 4 USB-As. The enclosure is surprisingly nice. It's made out of extruded aluminum with solid ABS plastic front and back panels that are bolted through, so there's no squeaks. It feels really solid. On top is a heavy-duty ABS plastic handle that allows you to carry it one-handed, which is much nicer than my Goal Zero Yeti. Around back there's a pair of AC outputs that supply 1000 watts continuous pure sine wave and 1200 watts peak. This is a little small for a generator of this size, and we'll look at that in more detail later. At the top is a large cooling fan, and that's complemented with another cooling fan at the bottom front panel. And there's rubber feet on the bottom so that it doesn't slide around too much when it's on a surface. So I think the question in many people's minds is, how does this really stack up to a Goal Zero product? Well, let's take a look. So I think the closest competitor to this unit is the Yeti 1500X. They both have 1500 watt hours of lithium ion power. However, the Yeti is twice as much money. And the Bluetti has actually a higher quality cell. It's an LG automotive pouch cell that is capable of 1500 cycles versus only 500 for the Yeti. So you're going to get 3 times the lifespan out of this device. Both have very efficient MPPT solar input charging, but the Bluetti does handle higher voltages, which is great. If you're looking to run large AC appliances, the Yeti has a much stronger inverter, which is capable of 2000 watts continuous, 3500 watts peak, which is significantly more than the 1000 watts continuous, 1200 watts peak for the Bluetti. So that's probably the major difference between these units. Otherwise, you know, the Bluetti will have more USB-A ports, but fewer USB-C ports with less power than the Yeti, but kind of small differences there. As far as the included power supply goes, the Bluetti comes with a 220 watt wall charger, which is really great. The Yeti, however, only comes with a 120 watt wall charger, which is really unacceptable for a unit of this size. And they actually want to charge you an extra $100 to get a charger that's equivalent to the Bluetti. So you got to factor that into your pricing. However, the Yeti can have a super fast charger at 600 watts if you're willing to pony up an extra $200, while the Bluetti does not have an upgrade option for that. Now I own a Yeti 1000, which is the earlier generation. You can get that for about $760 refurbished on eBay. Now that has a 1000 watt hour battery, again with the 500 cycles, and that only has a PWM solar charge controller, and the DC output is unregulated, which makes it difficult to run a fridge with it, and it only comes with a 60 watt wall charger. So there's a bunch of deltas there if you're using an older Yeti. So let's say you have $1,000 to spend. You could get this refurbed Yeti 1000. You'd have to buy this $100 MPPT solar module, $40 for this 12 volt regulated cable to run a fridge, and then another $100 to upgrade the power supply to be equivalent. Basically all in for $1,000 for a refurbed Yeti 1000 with all these little upgrades versus spending $1,000 on their brand new Bluetti EB150 with 50% more battery capacity. It's kind of a hard sell. But if you are curious about size, this is what my Yeti 1000 looks like next to the Bluetti EB150. If you had a 1500X, that would be about 3 inches taller. So in the box, they include a really nice 8mm to MC4 connector. Now this cable I've bought in the past is about $20, and this is something that you do not get with the Goal Zero units. In addition, you get this nice power supply that again can put out 220 watts, and it does have a fan on the side, so I will say that this power supply is fairly loud. It's actually louder than the fan on the unit itself. The green light on the power brick turns to red when you plug it in, and that's when you know you're charging. As I said, you're getting 220 watts of charging power, which is really good. It's much better than you're going to get out of the box with any sort of Goal Zero product. And if we compare the power brick on the Goal Zero to the Bluetti, it's a pretty big difference. It's passively cooled on the Goal Zero unit. There's a big fan on this one. And, you know, it's pretty impressive that you're getting 4 times the charging power with something that's not that much bigger. And remember when I talked about upgrades? All the earlier reviews of this unit said it had a 170 watt power adapter, and this one's 220. So I think Bluetti just upgraded it and didn't tell anyone. Having a regulated 12 volt output is really important if you want to run something like a mini fridge. In the manual it listed as 12.8 volts, and other reviews even said 12.4, but I consistently got 13.5 volts regardless of the state of charge of battery. So I think they upgraded this at the firmware level. If you compare this to my Goal Zero Yeti 1000, it only puts out a measly 12.4 volts. So let's test my Dometic CFX 375 dual zone refrigerator freezer. And in my case, I have both sides set to be a freezer at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is very much a torture test for running a fridge freezer. So when I did the same test with the AC50 with 1/3 the capacity, it ran for 10 hours. And checking in at 22 hours, the battery was around 30 or 40%. It's hard to tell with that meter. And in the end, I got 30 hours, so it performed exactly as expected. Next up, let's talk about USB. So this has a single 45 watt USB-C with power delivery, and that's generally going to be good for a smaller laptop, but in my case I have a 15-inch MacBook Pro that likes to have closer to 80 watts of power, so I really wish this had a higher wattage power delivery, maybe a 60 or even 75 watt, but I would say this works okay for smaller laptops. This also has 4 very standard USB-A outputs. They are rated at 3 amps or 15 watts for a single one, or they work in pairs. So between a pair of them, you basically get 3 amps. So no quick charge, none of that fanciness, but they do work. And I was able to charge my iPad mini, my iPad Air, a battery bank, and a number of other things simultaneously, and everything worked great. So USB is fairly solid, I would say. So moving on, let's take a look at the AC output and see how strong the inverter is on this. We're going to do a couple tests. The first one I want to do is a output test. So we're going to be using this meter to see how much power we're pulling and how many kilowatt hours we can get out of this thing. I'm going to be using my heat gun because that allows me to dial in exactly what power I want. And when we plug this in, I'm going to be aiming for around 225, 250 watts or so, which would drain this in about, say, 5 hours or so. The curious thing though is I plugged this in, and as I was dialing it, the numbers seemed really high. So you can see this is almost 400 watts peak, which seemed really strange because my meter here says I'm only pulling 210 watts. Which seemed really, really strange. So I grabbed my kilowatt just for a sanity check, and that also is saying 200 watts. So something is up with the AC output meter on this thing. It greatly exaggerates the draw. So just be warned about that. So even though this is saying 350 to 400 watts, I'm only pulling about 225 watts. And we're just going to run this down until it dies. And what I did here, testing halfway through the regulated output, and it's perfectly fine at 13.5 volts, and checking the heat, it's only about mid 70s, so this thing is staying cool. And here we are in the home stretch, and you see it just died. And plugging this back in, turning it on, you see the battery is 100% dead. And I got 1.211 kilowatt hours out of this thing. And interestingly, I'm still getting 13.5 volts, even when it's perfectly dead. So here I got 80% of the rated capacity, which I think is pretty average. And just to be sure, I wanted to do the same test with my Yeti 1000 and see what I got there. So I'll plug this in, use the same exact meter I was using before. And before I get comments about the fact that the Yeti does not look to be 100% charged, that's because the meters are messed up and it never gets above 95%. So putting this on low, you can see I'm pulling, according to this, about 275 watts, and that matches what the Yeti says it's putting out. So this is what I would expect to happen. But something with this Bluetti unit really exaggerates what that number is, which is really curious. So we're going to run the same test. We're going to run it all the way down. This is a little more challenging because, again, I'm pulling a little more power than I was, and this is a smaller battery. So at the end of the test, according to the Yeti, it had put out 820 watt hours. The meter said 799. We're going to call it 800, which is, again, 80% of the rated capacity. So both of these put out the same rough percentage in terms of efficiency round trip. But because the Bluetti is a much larger battery, you're going to have 400 watt hours of additional usable capacity. All right, next test I want to look at is max output. So I'm going to use my gun here and just start turning it up. See, we're over 1,000 and it's rated only at 1,000 continuous here. So we're going to go higher and higher. And there we go. Error 13, which means overload protection according to the manual. So looks like it really doesn't like being much above 1,000 watts. We're going to repeat this test to see what happens again, just to make sure that it is consistent. And there we go. So looks like once you go above 1,200 watts, at most, it will definitely trip the overload on this thing. It's pretty sensitive. There's not a lot of headroom here. And just as a point of comparison, I'm going to do the same test with my Goal Zero 1000. And I think you'll see there's a pretty big difference. So I was able to turn the heat gun on high and turn the knob all the way up, and it put out 1,400 watts, you know, basically no problem at all. In fact, I had to add a space heater on low and then combine that with the heat gun to get this number way up so that it would cause it to trip. So by turning the knob, you can see it goes up to 1,800 watts and then 2,000 and then 2,200 watts. This thing just keeps going and going and going. It takes a lot of power to make this Yeti trip. When it does though, it's pretty unhappy and it takes a little while for it to restart. But I'm putting 2400 watts out here and you know, it's still going. Not that it would do it forever, but the Yeti really does have a much stronger inverter in it. So even though the Goal Zero Yeti inverters are stronger, I want to be clear that the Bluetti is performing exactly within its rated specifications. It could handle 1200 watts peak for a minute or two, and I wanted to confirm it would really handle 1000 watts continuously. So to do that, I redid the test with a charged up unit, and I was able to run it for a full hour at 1000 watts of output. So it ran a little bit hotter, but this thing performed like a champ. And you always hear that a large refrigerator has a big spike when the compressor kicks on. So I figured it might be good to test that with this device just because 1000 watts is not a lot of headroom. But I was able to run my fridge for 30 hours straight, so no problems at all there. There's one other quirk with the AC power meter on this thing. If you have small loads, I believe under 30 watts, they simply don't show up at all. So in this case, I have this very small light that probably only uses a couple watts. And on my Yeti, it says 8 watts, but on this unit, it says nothing. So essentially, it doesn't detect small loads, and big loads, it tends to exaggerate the size. Let's talk about solar charging. So this unit has a really impressive solar charging capability. It has the super efficient MPPT style charger, and it can handle from 16 to 60 volts DC, which is great. And it can handle 500 watts of solar power. Now I have these panels here that are 25 or 26 volts open circuit, and I have 400 watt panels. And so in order to maximize it, I need to take the first pair of panels and connect them in series, so that will add their voltages. And so you can see we're at 50 volts here. And then I didn't have a fourth flexible, so we're combining that with this glass one, and I'm combining those into a pair in series as well. And again, always check your voltages to make sure you wired things correctly. And you can see here, this other pair is at 52 volts, which is close enough. And then I'm going to connect both of those pairs in parallel because we can't go any higher or we'd exceed the 60 volts. So I'm using this combiner cable to make all that happen. And then we can just plug it into the supplied cable that goes from MC4 into 8mm. So a little bit more complicated wiring here because we're trying to maximize our voltage. But at this point, I have 4 100 watt panels hooked in to this unit. I didn't have any larger panels, so that's all I can really test. And as always, when I'm testing solar, it's never ideal conditions. And these are also not angled, so there's going to be some efficiency loss there. But you can see as the controller starts to stabilize here, our 400 watt panels are giving us, say 230 watts or so, maybe a little more. As the day went on, I got, up to 250 watts. And so it seemed pretty solid. I can definitely prove that I can get 400 watts of power into this unit. And the extra 60 volts of headroom versus 50 on the Yeti just makes this more compatible with a wider range of panels. So one thing I was curious about is which one of these two units has a more efficient charge controller. So I plugged the same 100 watt panel into the Yeti and then plug that into the Bluetti right afterwards. And it's a pretty dramatic difference considering that these are both MPPT controllers. I'm getting a significant amount more energy from the Bluetti. Say 75, 76 watts here. And when you plug it in to the Goal Zero Yeti, well, you're not getting much energy. I was consistently getting high 50s, maybe 60 watts, which is a far cry from 75 or 76. So I think I can declare that the Bluetti has a significantly better solar charge controller than even the upgraded MPPT module in my Goal Zero that I paid $100 for. So that's pretty amazing. I'm really impressed with the solar charging on this. Speaking of charging, one thing that I really like about the Goal Zero units is there's lots and lots of different inputs. So you could be plugging multiple solar panels or even also add a wall charger or a car charger at the same time and sum them. Now, the Bluetti just has one input. So everything you plug in has to be summed into that single 8mm input, which is kind of limiting, but it's also pretty typical for the industry. One final note on charging, the EB150 does not have a car charger, and so I was thinking maybe I could use the Goal Zero Yeti car charger because it is also 8mm. So I plugged it into this battery to test it. I have a lot of confidence that this probably would work. However, the Goal Zero Yeti doesn't quite fit in there. Their plug has an extra waterproof sheath on it, so it's not really going to work. I do think you could wire a different tip onto the Goal Zero Yeti car charger and it would work here. It has the right voltage and it's current regulated. If anyone's feeling brave and gives it a try, let me know in the comments. So here's my bottom line on the Bluetti EB150. After testing it, I actually like it much more than I thought I would. And I think for the money, for $1,000, for 1,500 watt hours of storage, you really can't go wrong. This is an excellent value. Now, if you're in the market for something that has a really strong inverter, this really isn't the device for you. But for most people, 1,000 watts is pretty solid. You can run the majority of appliances. I really like the high quality LG automotive pouch cells with the 1,500 cycle life, because ultimately how long this battery lasts is the most important feature to me. I also like that they've upgraded the charger and that the regulated 12 volt output is rock solid. The USB is fine. And you know, I think overall this is a really great unit. The MPPT charging is excellent. It's much better than the Goal Zero units. So that's my pros. I do have a couple cons. The main one for me is the display. I feel like the display is really lacking in detail. I really wish there was a proper 0 to 100% indicator instead of these 5 segments. And I think the shunt that measures the AC output is wildly inaccurate. So most of my issues are with the quality of the display, or at least the information that's displayed. And obviously the other one is that the inverter is fairly weak on this one. So those are the only 2 major cons. I think for the display, you're probably not going to be looking at all the time, so that's less of an issue. But the only thing I would say as a caveat is if you're trying to run larger appliances, you might want to think about Goal Zero for this. But otherwise, if you're looking for a great value, the Bluetti is really hard to beat. All right, everyone, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Please comment, let me know what you think, and be sure to like and subscribe. Thanks a lot.